If that shrew gets a share of Dad's money, I'll contest the entire will, my son shouted across the lawyer's office while the rest of our family sat frozen in silence. The words hit the room like shattered glass, sharp and impossible to ignore. For a moment, nobody moved. My sister-in-law lowered her coffee cup halfway to the table. My niece stared down at her lap. Even Martin Hayes, my late husband's attorney and closest friend, removed his glasses slowly, as if he suddenly needed help believing what he had just heard. I sat at the far end of the mahogany conference table with my hands folded neatly in my lap. I did not cry. I did not argue. I simply looked at my son and realized I no longer recognized the man standing in front of me. Brian Carter was 42 years old, successful, polished, respected in Hartford real estate circles, and at that exact moment, he looked more like a stranger than the little boy I once rocked to sleep during thunderstorms. Beside him, his wife Vanessa shifted uncomfortably in her cream-colored designer suit, though not because she was embarrassed. No, Vanessa looked nervous for a different reason. Her eyes flickered toward Martin for barely a second before she reached for Brian's arm and whispered something under her breath. Something careful, something controlling. But Brian pulled away from her touch and kept staring at me with open frustration. Dad promised me that company, he continued, his voice louder now. I spent 15 years helping him build it while she sat in that oversized house, spending his money. The oversized house. I almost smiled at that. Richard and I bought that colonial home in West Hartford 38 years ago when Brian was still learning how to tie his shoes. Back then, the roof leaked every spring, and the kitchen floor tilted slightly toward the window. Richard spent weekends repairing pipes while I worked double nursing shifts at St. Mary's Hospital to help pay the mortgage. There were years when we could barely afford summer vacations. Years when I wore the same winter coat until the lining tore open near the sleeves. But apparently, according to my son, I had simply sat there spending money. Martin cleared his throat softly. Brian, he said carefully, your father's will has not yet been fully presented. Then let's get on with it, Brian snapped. Because I'm not letting her manipulate this family anymore. Manipulate? Another interesting word. I noticed how Vanessa finally looked at me then, her expression polished with false sympathy. She had perfected that expression over the years. Concern mixed with quiet judgment. The kind of face people make when pretending to care about someone they secretly resent. I remembered the first time I met her 12 years ago at a restaurant outside New Haven. She had smiled brightly, complimented my pearl earrings, and spent the entire evening asking Richard questions about property investments and retirement accounts while barely speaking to me at all. Richard noticed it too. He mentioned it on the drive home that night, while rain tapped softly against the windshield. That girl watches people too carefully, he had said quietly. Like she's calculating something. At the time, I told him he was imagining things. I wanted Brian to be happy. Mothers do that sometimes. We explain away discomfort because the alternative hurts too much. Martin opened the thick leather folder in front of him while the grandfather clock near the office wall ticked loudly enough to make the silence feel heavier. Outside the large windows, snow drifted slowly across downtown Hartford, covering the sidewalks in soft white layers. Richard always loved the first snowfall of December. He used to stand near our kitchen window every winter morning, holding a cup of black coffee while listening to Sinatra records before work. It had only been 10 days since we buried him. 10 days since I stood beside his casket holding Brian's trembling hand, while Vanessa cried carefully measured tears into a silk handkerchief. 10 days, and already they were fighting over his money like hungry strangers. Your father made several amendments to his estate 6 months before his passing, Martin finally said. Brian straightened immediately. Vanessa's posture stiffened beside him. As of today, Martin continued, all final instructions must be read. Exactly as written. Brian laughed once under his breath. Good, he muttered. Because Dad knew who actually cared about this family. I lowered my eyes briefly toward the gold wedding band still resting on my finger. Richard had lost weight near the end. The cancer treatments drained him slowly, quietly, until his wedding ring slipped loose enough that he finally stopped wearing it. Mine still fit perfectly. Martin turned one page carefully, then another. His expression changed slightly. Not surprise. Not confusion. Something closer to concern. Then he looked directly at me. Evelyn, he said softly, your husband left very specific instructions regarding today. Brian leaned back impatiently in his chair. Then read them already. Martin inhaled slowly. Richard Carter included a personal statement to be played before the will can proceed. The room went still again. Vanessa's fingers tightened visibly around her handbag. Brian frowned. A recording? Martin nodded once. Yes. He paused before adding quietly. And according to your husband, Evelyn, he created it specifically for moments exactly like this one. Martin walked slowly toward the cabinet beside the bookshelf and removed a small silver flash drive from an envelope marked with Richard's handwriting. I recognized the blue ink immediately. My husband always pressed too hard when he wrote capital letters. Even after 40 years together, I could identify his handwriting from across a room. Brian crossed his arms impatiently, while Vanessa stared at the envelope with narrowed eyes. The office suddenly felt smaller than before. The heat hummed softly through the vents overhead, yet my hands felt cold against my lap. Martin inserted the drive into his computer without saying another word. The monitor reflected softly against the polished wood table while everyone waited in silence. Then Richard appeared on the screen. My breath caught for only a second. He was sitting in our sunroom wearing the dark green sweater I bought him 3 Christmases ago. Behind him, I could see the bird feeder hanging outside the window near the maple tree. Snow covered the backyard in the video too. Richard looked thinner then. I remembered, but his eyes were clear, calm, steady, alive in a way photographs could never capture. If you are watching this, he began quietly, then I am gone, and unfortunately, certain people have proven me right. Brian shifted immediately in his seat. Vanessa lowered her eyes. Richard paused in the recording as if gathering strength before continuing. I spent the last year of my life noticing things I should have noticed much earlier. Conversations that stopped when Evelyn entered the room. Questions about bank accounts before my medical appointments had even ended. Sudden interest in property values. Vacation plans discussed while my wife was sitting alone beside a hospice bed. Nobody moved. I could hear the ticking clock again. Slow. Heavy. Richard folded his hands together in the video exactly the way he always did when he was disappointed. My wife stood beside me for 4 decades, he said. She worked night shifts while I built my company. She held this family together through layoffs, surgeries, miscarriages, and years when we barely had enough money to buy groceries. My throat tightened slightly at that word. Miscarriages. There had been 2 before Brian was born. Richard never forgot them. If anyone sitting in that room has made Evelyn feel unwanted, humiliated, or disposable after my death, Richard continued, then they never understood who truly built this family. Brian exhaled sharply through his nose. This is ridiculous, he muttered under his breath, though not loudly enough to interrupt the recording. Martin remained perfectly still beside the desk. Richard leaned slightly closer to the camera then, and for the first time, his expression hardened. I especially want my son to understand something very clearly. Wealth does not reveal character. It reveals loyalty. And if you allowed greed, pressure, or outside influence to poison your heart against your mother, then you have already lost more than money. Vanessa looked toward Brian instantly after those words, but he kept staring at the screen with growing anger. I watched him carefully and suddenly remembered the little boy who used to run into our bedroom after nightmares, carrying his blanket behind him like a cape. Richard used to laugh and pull him into the middle of the bed between us. Back then, Brian loved us without calculation. Somewhere along the years, something inside him had changed quietly enough that I almost missed it. Richard took a slow breath in the video before speaking again. Martin will now explain the conditions attached to my estate. I created them for one reason only: to protect my wife after I no longer could. Then the screen went black. For several seconds after the screen went dark, nobody in the office spoke. The silence felt different now. Heavier. Not the awkward silence from before, but the kind that settles over people when the truth enters a room and refuses to leave. Brian leaned back in his chair and rubbed both hands across his face with visible frustration. Dad was sick, he finally said. Cancer changes people. Vanessa and I spent months helping him manage things while Mom sat around pretending everything was normal. I kept my eyes on the black computer screen where Richard's face had disappeared only moments earlier. Pretending everything was normal. That was an interesting accusation coming from the same son who missed half of his father's treatments because of important client dinners. Martin closed the laptop gently before turning toward Brian. Your father was mentally sound when these documents were finalized, he said calmly. 2 physicians signed competency statements the same week. Vanessa spoke for the first time in nearly 10 minutes. Nobody is questioning Richard's health, she said carefully, though her voice carried the same polished edge I had learned to recognize years ago. We are simply trying to understand why Evelyn is suddenly being portrayed as some helpless victim. Helpless. Another carefully chosen word. I looked at her then. Really looked at her. Her blonde hair remained perfectly styled despite the snow outside. Not a single crease touched her cream-colored coat folded beside her chair. Vanessa always appeared composed in public. That was part of her talent. She knew how to make cruelty sound reasonable. Richard used to call it corporate charm. The room gets colder when she smiles, he once whispered to me after a Christmas dinner years ago. At the time, I laughed. Now I understood exactly what he meant. Martin opened another folder slowly. Thick papers rested inside, each marked with colored tabs and legal notes. Richard established what is known as a behavioral inheritance clause, he explained. Brian frowned immediately. What? A legal condition attached to the estate, Martin continued. If any beneficiary engages in intimidation, harassment, public humiliation, or coercive attempts toward Evelyn Carter after Richard's death, their inheritance rights may be permanently revoked. Brian let out a sharp laugh, filled with disbelief. That is insane. No, Martin replied quietly. It is very specific. Vanessa's expression changed for only a second. Most people in the room would have missed it. But I saw the tension near her jaw, the sudden stillness in her eyes. Fear rarely announces itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives in tiny fractures. Brian stood abruptly from his chair and began pacing near the windows overlooking downtown Hartford. Snow continued falling outside in slow drifting waves, covering parked cars and empty sidewalks below. So what now? He snapped. Mom says we hurt her feelings, and suddenly she gets everything? Martin folded his hands together. This is not about hurt feelings. Your father documented concerns over several incidents during the past year. Brian stopped pacing. What incidents? Martin looked directly at him before answering. The unauthorized attempts to access Richard's private financial records while he was hospitalized. The pressure regarding the lake house sale. The conversations witnessed by hospice staff concerning property division before Richard had even passed away. Vanessa's face lost color instantly. Brian turned toward her so quickly that even she looked startled. What is he talking about? He asked. Vanessa opened her mouth, then closed it again. I remembered the afternoon 6 months earlier when I walked quietly into Richard's hospital room, carrying coffee from the lobby cafe. Vanessa had been standing near his bed speaking in low, urgent tones while Brian stared down at property documents spread across the blanket. The moment they noticed me, both papers disappeared into a leather folder. Richard looked exhausted afterward. At the time, I convinced myself grief made people act strangely. But grief was not the problem sitting in that office now. Greed was. Martin removed one final document from the folder and placed it carefully on the table between us. There is more, he said softly, and I strongly suggest everyone remains seated before we continue. Brian slowly sat back down, but the anger in his face had changed shape. It was no longer loud and careless like before. Now it looked uncertain, dangerous in a quieter way. Vanessa remained perfectly still beside him, though I noticed her fingers twisting the diamond bracelet around her wrist over and over again. She only did that when she felt cornered. I learned that during a Thanksgiving dinner 4 years earlier when Richard casually mentioned updating our trust documents. Vanessa smiled through the entire meal that night, but her bracelet never stopped moving. Martin adjusted the papers in front of him with careful precision. 3 months before his death, he said, Richard hired a private financial investigator. Brian blinked in disbelief. What? Your father became concerned after several unusual transactions appeared connected to one of his business accounts, Martin explained. Large document requests, password reset attempts, repeated inquiries regarding property transfers. Brian immediately turned toward Vanessa again. Did you know about this? Vanessa looked offended now. Of course not. But her voice arrived half a second too late. I saw it instantly. So did Martin. Richard always believed hesitation revealed more truth than words. People rehearse lies, he used to say, but surprise forces honesty through the cracks. Outside the office windows, the snowstorm had thickened. The city below looked softer now beneath the white haze. Quiet. distant. I suddenly remembered another winter afternoon nearly 30 years ago when Brian was 12 years old and insisted on shoveling our driveway by himself after school because Richard had the flu. He worked for nearly 2 hours in oversized gloves, leaving crooked, uneven paths through the snow while refusing every offer of help. Richard stood at the front door, smiling proudly the entire time. "That boy has a good heart," he told me back then. I wondered where that boy had gone. Martin slid a manila envelope across the table toward me. "Richard instructed me to give this to Evelyn personally if concerns escalated during the reading." My name looked steady and familiar in Richard's handwriting. I touched the envelope gently, but did not open it yet. Brian leaned forward immediately. "What is inside?" Martin did not answer him. Vanessa tried a different approach. Her voice softened suddenly, almost delicate. "Evelyn," she said carefully, "I think everyone here is emotional after losing Richard. Maybe some misunderstandings have been exaggerated." There it was again, that polished corporate warmth she used whenever she needed control. She spoke the same way to waiters when restaurants made mistakes. Calm enough to appear reasonable, cold enough to make people nervous. I looked directly at her for the first time that afternoon. "Richard was never confused," I said quietly. Vanessa's expression tightened almost invisibly. Brian exhaled sharply and rubbed his forehead. "This entire thing feels like a setup." Martin folded his hands together. "Your father anticipated that response as well." Brian laughed bitterly. "Of course he did." Martin opened another folder and removed several printed photographs. He placed them face down on the table without revealing them immediately. Something about the movement changed the atmosphere in the room. Even my niece shifted nervously near the far wall. "Your father documented meetings that occurred while he was receiving treatment at St. Francis Hospital," Martin said carefully. "Meetings involving discussions about transferring ownership of the lake house and portions of Carter Holdings before his death." Brian stared at the photographs without touching them. Vanessa looked pale now beneath the office lighting. "That is ridiculous," she whispered. Martin slowly turned over the first photograph. It showed Brian and Vanessa sitting with a financial consultant at a restaurant in downtown Hartford. The timestamp was visible in the corner. The same afternoon, Richard underwent chemotherapy alone because Brian claimed he was trapped in court depositions. I remembered waiting beside Richard for nearly 4 hours that day while he kept checking his phone between treatments. He never complained once. He only smiled weakly and said, "Brian is busy building his future." Martin turned over the second photograph, then the third. With every image, the room seemed to grow quieter. Finally, Brian spoke, though this time his voice sounded smaller than before. "Dad hired someone to follow us." "No," Martin replied softly. "Your father hired someone to protect your mother." The photographs remained spread across the table like silent accusations. Nobody reached for them. Nobody denied what they showed. Brian stared down at the images with his jaw clenched tightly, while Vanessa sat unnaturally straight beside him, her eyes fixed on the far wall, as if refusing to look directly at the evidence might somehow weaken it. Martin carefully gathered the photographs back into the folder before speaking again. "Richard did not make these decisions impulsively," he said. "He spent months documenting patterns of behavior." Brian shook his head slowly. "This is unbelievable." His voice sounded different now, less confident. I realized something then. My son had walked into that office expecting control. He expected signatures, numbers, predictable outcomes. He expected me to sit quietly while he inherited the future he already imagined belonged to him. Instead, he was discovering that his father had been watching everything. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. Outside, snow continued falling steadily across Hartford, muting the sounds of traffic below. I remembered how Richard loved snowstorms because they forced people to slow down. Bad weather reveals character. He once told me during a blackout years ago while we sat wrapped in blankets beside the fireplace. Some people pull others closer. Some only think about themselves. Vanessa finally leaned forward. "Evelyn," she said softly, "you know we loved Richard." Loved. Another word carefully selected for performance. I studied her face for a moment before answering. Love does not begin discussing property division while someone is still alive. The silence afterward felt sharp enough to cut through the room. Brian immediately looked toward Vanessa again. This time there was suspicion in his expression. Small, but visible. Cracks were beginning to form. Martin opened the final section of the estate file and adjusted his glasses. There is one additional condition attached to the inheritance structure, he said carefully. Brian rubbed both hands over his face. What now? Richard transferred full controlling ownership of Carter Holdings 6 months ago. Brian froze. Transferred it to who? Martin looked directly at me before answering. To Evelyn. Brian stared at me as if I had suddenly become someone else entirely. Vanessa's mouth parted slightly in disbelief. For a second, neither of them spoke. I felt no satisfaction watching their reactions. Only exhaustion. The kind that settles deep into a person after too many disappointments. Brian stood again so abruptly that his chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. That is impossible. No, Martin replied calmly. It is legally finalized and fully enforceable. Brian looked at me now with something I had not seen from him in years. Panic. Mom, he said quickly, you do not know how to run that company. I almost smiled at that. For decades, men had assumed I stood quietly beside Richard without understanding the business we built together. They never noticed who balanced accounts during the recession in 1998, who negotiated supplier contracts while Richard recovered from surgery, who stayed awake at 2 a.m. helping him prepare expansion proposals at our kitchen table while Brian slept upstairs. Richard noticed. He always noticed. Your father trusted me, I said quietly. Brian turned toward Martin again. Dad promised that company would stay with me. Martin's expression remained steady. Your father promised to protect his wife first. Vanessa suddenly spoke with unusual sharpness. So this entire thing was planned. Against us from the beginning. Martin folded his hands together. No, it was planned in case Richard's concerns proved correct. Vanessa looked away immediately after that. I noticed her bracelet moving again around her wrist. Faster this time. Brian stared at the floor for several long seconds before speaking quietly. You really think we were trying to steal from you? His question sounded almost childlike. Almost wounded. I thought about the hospital room, the hidden paperwork, the whispered conversations, the impatience after the funeral, the word shrew thrown across a room full of people only an hour earlier. Then I thought about Richard sitting alone through chemotherapy while our son attended private meetings about property transfers. I think your father saw things clearly before I did, I answered softly. And for the first time since entering that office, Brian had no response at all. The meeting should have ended there, but nobody moved. It was as if the entire room had become trapped between two versions of our family. The one we pretended to be for years, and the one finally sitting in front of us without masks. Brian lowered himself slowly back into his chair, while Vanessa stared at the snow outside with distant eyes. For the first time since Richard died, neither of them looked confident. Martin quietly organized the documents into neat stacks while the grandfather clock continued ticking near the bookshelf. I used to love that clock. Richard bought it during a weekend trip to Vermont nearly 20 years ago. He insisted on strapping it carefully into the back of our station wagon himself because he said fragile things deserve patience. That was the kind of man he was. Patient, careful, observant. Even near the end of his life, when pain left shadows beneath his eyes, Richard still noticed details other people missed. Especially when it came to me. Brian finally cleared his throat. Mom, he said quietly, why didn't you tell me any of this? His voice sounded tired now. Younger somehow. I folded my gloves carefully on the table before answering. Because I did not know. That part was true. Richard never discussed the final details of the estate with me. He only held my hand one evening in the hospice room while snow drifted softly beyond the hospital windows and said, when the time comes, trust Martin. At the time, I thought he was preparing me for paperwork. I did not realize he was preparing me for betrayal. Vanessa turned toward me slowly. You honestly believe we wanted to hurt you? She asked. There was something almost offended in her tone, as if she considered herself the wounded person in the room. I looked at her bracelet again, still twisting around her wrist. Richard noticed that habit long before I did. People reveal themselves through repetition. He once told me while trimming hedges in our backyard. Especially nervous people. I suddenly remembered the afternoon Vanessa insisted we should sell the lake house less than 2 weeks after Richard received his diagnosis. She claimed it would reduce stress on the family. Brian agreed immediately without even asking how I felt. Richard remained silent during the entire conversation. Later that night, after they left, he sat quietly at the kitchen table staring into his coffee for nearly an hour. They are already reorganizing the future, he said softly. I did not understand what he meant back then. Now I did. Brian leaned forward with both elbows on his knees. We were trying to help, he said. Dad was sick. There were business decisions to make. Martin looked at him calmly. Business decisions generally happen after funerals, Brian. Not during chemotherapy. Brian flinched slightly at the words. Vanessa immediately touched his arm again, but this time he did not pull away. He looked exhausted more than angry now. The office lights reflected faintly against the snow-covered streets outside, while late afternoon shadows stretched across the room. My niece quietly gathered her coat near the doorway, clearly uncomfortable witnessing the collapse happening in front of her. Families rarely fall apart all at once. Usually they crack slowly beneath years of ignored selfishness until one difficult moment finally exposes everything underneath. Martin slid one final paper toward me. There is also a personal letter Richard requested Evelyn read. Privately, he said. Brian looked up immediately. What letter? Martin's expression remained polite but firm. That instruction concerns Evelyn alone. Vanessa's face tightened again. Control was slipping beyond her reach now, and she knew it. I carefully placed the unopened envelope into my purse beside my gloves. Then I stood for the first time since entering the office. The room felt strangely quiet around me. Not hostile anymore. Just hollow. Brian looked up as if he wanted to say something else, but no words came. I studied my son for a long moment. The expensive suit. The tired eyes. The fear he could no longer hide. I thought about the little boy who once waited at the front window every evening for his father's car headlights to appear at the end of the street. Richard used to lift him into the air the moment he walked through the front door. They adored each other once. That was the tragedy sitting in front of me. Not the money. Not the company. The loss of something good long before this day ever arrived. I picked up my coat slowly and looked at Brian one final time. Your father spent his last months protecting me, I said quietly. You should ask yourself why he believed he needed to. The elevator ride down from Martin's office felt longer than it should have. Nobody spoke during the descent. Brian stood beside Vanessa with his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets while the mirrored walls reflected for exhausted strangers pretending not to look at one another. I held my purse close against my side, feeling the unopened letter inside like a quiet heartbeat. When the elevator doors opened into the lobby, cold air drifted through the glass entrance each time someone stepped in from the snow outside. Hartford looked washed pale beneath the storm. Cars moved slowly through slush-covered streets while pedestrians kept their heads down against the wind. Brian finally spoke once we reached the sidewalk. Mom, wait. I stopped, but did not turn immediately. Snowflakes landed softly across the sleeve of my dark wool coat. Richard bought this coat for me 8 winters ago after I refused to replace the old one with the torn lining. You deserve warm. Thanks, he told me that Christmas morning while helping me button it near the fireplace. I turned slowly toward my son. Up close, he looked older than 42. Tired around the eyes. Worn down in places success could not hide. Vanessa remained a few feet behind him, unusually silent now. Brian exhaled slowly into the cold air. I know today looked bad. I almost smiled at the choice of words. Looked bad, as if appearances were still the problem. Your father died 10 days ago, I said quietly, and your first instinct was to threaten me over money. Brian rubbed his forehead. That is not fair. No, I answered softly. It is accurate. He stared at me for several seconds without speaking. Behind him, snow gathered along the shoulders of his expensive charcoal coat. Suddenly, I remembered another winter day nearly 25 years earlier when Brian fell through thin ice beside Miller Pond while trying to impress friends after school. Richard drove there so fast he forgot to put on shoes. I still remembered the way he wrapped Brian in blankets afterward while shaking harder than our son was. We loved that boy with everything we had. Maybe that was part of the problem. Sometimes people raised with too much protection mistake love for entitlement. Vanessa stepped forward carefully then. Evelyn, she said, nobody wanted this situation to become ugly. Ugly. Another polished word designed to soften something much darker underneath. I looked at her calmly. You started discussing the lake house before Richard finished chemotherapy. Her face stiffened immediately. That was practical planning. No, I replied quietly. It was greed wearing polite clothing. Brian looked sharply toward Vanessa after that. The crack between them widened slightly more. Small fractures. Quiet damage. the kind Richard always noticed long before anyone else. A black sedan pulled slowly toward the curb nearby to collect passengers from the office building. The city lights had already begun glowing through the snowfall, even though it was barely late afternoon. Winter evenings arrived early in Connecticut. Brian shoved his hands deeper into his pockets before speaking again. Dad should have talked to me directly if he had concerns. I thought about that for a moment. Richard had tried, many times. There were dinners Brian canceled. Phone calls rushed short. Weekends postponed because clients suddenly mattered more. Toward the end, Richard stopped expecting emotional honesty from our son. He only observed him quietly instead. Your father spent months trying to understand who you had become, I said softly. I think what frightened him most was that you stopped noticing it yourself. Brian looked away immediately. Snow collected along the sidewalk between us while traffic lights reflected red and gold against the wet pavement. Vanessa touched his arm gently again, but this time her expression carried something colder than fear. Calculation. She was already measuring losses. I could see it now clearly. The company, the properties, the future she imagined slipping beyond reach. Then Brian surprised me. Did Dad leave anything for me at all? The question sounded smaller than the others. Less angry. Almost ashamed. I looked at my son standing beneath the falling snow and realized money was no longer the thing separating us. Trust was. And once trust breaks inside a family, even love struggles to recognize itself afterward. I tightened my coat against the cold wind before answering quietly. Your father left you a chance to become a better man. What you do with it is up to you now. The drive home felt quieter than any winter evening I could remember. Snow brushed softly across the windshield while the heater hummed through the vents, filling the car with dry warmth that never quite reached my hands. Hartford disappeared slowly behind me in blurred white lights and frozen sidewalks. I kept both hands steady on the steering wheel while Richard's unopened letter rested inside my purse on the passenger seat beside me. I did not open it immediately. Some things deserve silence before understanding. By the time I pulled into the driveway, dusk had already settled across the neighborhood. Our colonial house stood beneath a layer of fresh snow, every window glowing softly against the darkening sky. For a moment, I remained sitting in the car, without moving. Richard used to wave from the kitchen window whenever he heard the garage door open. Even during the difficult months near the end, he still tried. That was the cruel thing about grief. Your mind continues searching for someone your heart already knows is gone. I stepped carefully onto the snow-covered walkway and unlocked the front door. The house greeted me with stillness. No music, no television, no scent of Richard's coffee drifting from the kitchen. Only silence and the faint ticking of the hallway clock. I removed my coat slowly and hung it beside Richard's old brown scarf still resting on the hook where he left it weeks earlier. I had not touched it since the funeral. The living room looked exactly the same as the morning he left for the hospital the final time. His reading glasses remained beside the armchair near the fireplace. One of his history books still rested open upside down on the side table with a bookmark halfway through the chapter. Ordinary objects suddenly become sacred after loss. I carried my purse into the kitchen and finally removed the envelope Martin gave me. My name stretched across the front in Richard's familiar handwriting. Simple, steady, personal. I sat down at the kitchen table where we spent thousands of evenings together over 4 decades and opened the letter carefully. The paper trembled slightly in my hands. Evelyn, if you are reading this, then I was right about something I prayed I would be wrong about. I stopped for a moment after that sentence. Outside the kitchen window, snow continued falling gently across the backyard. The maple tree near the fence bent beneath the weight of fresh white branches. Richard planted that tree the summer Brian turned 10 years old. It will outlive all of us, he joked back then while Brian chased fireflies across the lawn. I looked back down at the letter. You spent your entire life protecting other people from disappointment, especially our son. I understand why. You loved him before he ever learned who he would become. But love cannot fix weakness people refuse to confront in themselves. I closed my eyes briefly after reading those words. Richard never spoke harshly. Unless he believed honesty mattered more than comfort. Even during arguments, he chose silence over cruelty, which meant he wrote this letter carefully, deliberately. Every sentence weighed beforehand. I continued reading slowly. Brian is not evil. That would be easier to understand. He is simply too willing to justify selfishness when someone whispers that he deserves more. Vanessa only accelerated what already existed beneath the surface. The house felt colder suddenly despite the heat running through the vents. Somewhere upstairs, an old pipe clicked softly behind the walls. Richard always promised he would finally replace the upstairs plumbing after retirement. We thought we had more time for unfinished things. I kept reading. Do not spend the rest of your life trying to rescue people from the consequences of their own choices. I know you, Evelyn. You will want to forgive quickly because anger exhausts you. But forgiveness without accountability only teaches people that loyalty is weakness. I stared at that sentence for a long time. Then my eyes moved toward the final paragraph near the bottom of the page. I protected you because I saw what was happening long before you allowed yourself to admit it. And if Brian ever truly understands what he lost today, it will not be the company or the money. It will be the realization that his father trusted his mother more than he trusted his own son. I lowered the letter slowly onto the kitchen table. The house remained silent around me except for the faint sound of snow tapping softly against the windows. Then, for the first time since Richard died, I finally cried. Winter passed slowly after that night. January became February, and then the frozen sidewalks outside our house softened beneath the first cold rain of early March. The world kept moving with uncomfortable normalcy while grief settled quietly into the corners of my life like dust nobody else could see. I returned to Carter Holdings 3 weeks after the funeral. The first morning felt strange, familiar and foreign at the same time. Employees stopped talking when I entered conference rooms. Some looked surprised to see me there at all. Others looked relieved. Richard used to joke that people underestimated me because I spoke softly and wore pearl earrings instead of expensive watches. It gives you an advantage, he always said with a smile. Nobody notices the strongest person in the room until it is too late. Brian continued working at the company during those first months, though something inside him had changed after the reading of the will. The confidence was gone. He moved through the office carefully now, quieter than before. We rarely spoke beyond necessary business conversations. Sometimes I would catch him staring at Richard's old office through the glass hallway with an expression I could not fully read. Regret, perhaps, or guilt finally settling into place his arrogance once occupied. Vanessa stopped visiting the office entirely after February. Rumors traveled quietly through the staff before eventually reaching me through Martin during lunch one afternoon. Separate apartments, marriage counseling, financial disagreements. The details did not interest me as much as they once might have. Richard was right about something else too. Once trust breaks, people begin revealing themselves faster than before. One rainy Thursday in April, Brian appeared at my office doorway just after 6 in the evening. Most employees had already gone home. The building felt unusually still except for the low hum of fluorescent lights and distant traffic outside. He looked exhausted. Older somehow. Do you have a minute? He asked quietly. I closed the financial report in front of me and nodded toward the chair across from my desk. Brian sat down slowly without removing his coat. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he looked at his hands and said something I never expected to hear from my son. Dad was disappointed in me long before he got sick. Was he not? The question hung heavily between us. I thought about lying to comfort him. Mothers are tempted to do that, to soften truth until it no longer resembles itself. But Richard spent his final months protecting honesty, even when honesty hurt. Your father loved you very much, I answered carefully. But toward the end, he became afraid of the choices you were making. Brian nodded once without looking up. His eyes looked red with exhaustion. Vanessa kept telling me we deserved more after all the years I worked for him, he admitted quietly. After a while, I started believing it. Outside my office window, rain streaked softly across the dark glass overlooking downtown Hartford. Richard used to stand near this same window during storms while drinking terrible vending machine coffee and pretending it tasted fine. I missed him suddenly with such force that it nearly stole my breath. Brian finally looked at me again. I said terrible things to you that day. I folded my hands together on the desk. Yes, I said softly. He swallowed hard before speaking again. I do not expect forgiveness. That sentence mattered more than any apology could have. Because for the first time in years, my son sounded honest. Not defensive, not entitled, just painfully aware of himself. I stood slowly from behind the desk and walked toward the window beside Richard's old bookshelf. The city lights reflected softly against the wet streets below, while spring rain tapped against the glass. Your father left you something more valuable than money, I said quietly.